Hey, and welcome to this module in our Titration video series. We're going to be discussing federation. Federation is the ability to join one or more Titration clusters together to reach high-scaling workload protection in a really easy way where you have a centralized single pane of glass of control. So Remi, federation. Why are we going to be using federation in some circumstances?
In most of the cases where we're actually talking to customers and we want to deploy and look into federation, it's a scale problem. It's like 99% of the cases, it's scale. I have a cluster, my environment is more than 25,000 sensors, I need to reach much higher than that. Think federation. You can add more clusters, you can expand that higher.
Okay, so you're saying that federation is to horizontally scale Titration.
Yeah,
and you mentioned
absolutely.
Up to 25,000 agents. So what we're saying is federation is a topic that you really should look into if you're going above 25,000 agents. If you are within inside that number, then we recommend vertically scaling Titration by going either from the Titration virtual appliance to the medium-sized appliance or to the larger-sized appliance. Once you've maximized the vertical scaling, that's when you should start looking into horizontal scaling.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So what are some of the drivers that we've seen behind going for federation? So obviously scaling is the number one issue. If I need over 25,000 workloads and I want to orchestrate policy across hundreds of thousands of workloads, for example, federation is the way that we would do that. But there are some other concerns, right?
Always. And actually one of those concerns is those pesky Europeans.
Yeah, pesky Europeans, right?
Yeah, I know what I'm talking about. So on that topic, for example, you take places like France, Germany, Spain, they all have some very different legislation when it comes to data privacy.
Yeah, and we might even have some new legislation in the UK sometimes. So.
Exactly. So like you might want to prepare for those stuff.
Yep.
And if you're doing that and you're a multinational bank, you have to take that into account. So when you're doing that, you might have one cluster specific to Europe. Europe regulations are fairly close to each other for now.
Yep.
It might change in the future. So one cluster for Europe is usually okay. Then maybe they're worried about what might happen. They might deploy a second cluster in the UK at the moment. Maybe not. They might need one for Americas. They might need one for APJC. That can be those kind of regulatory problems that may fall in.
Oh, okay, so even though the data that we collect via our software agents is not personally identifiable data, sometimes there are regulations or just customer requirements that say, I want to keep that telemetry, I want to keep that policy data as close as possible to those workloads for some reason or another. So if you do have particular data locality requirements, then federation can also help you out with that.
Sounds good.
Yeah. And then finally, also the ability to control those multiple clusters at the same time. So you don't have to use federation. You can also have multiple standalone Titration clusters operating in different environments if scale is your only need. But if you're looking for scale and also the ability to have centralized control, have one single pane of glass where you can go to operate all of those clusters at the same time, then that's where federation also helps you out as well. So don't feel like you have to run into federation if you just have a problem with going to 50,000 workloads, for example. You could have two separate clusters, but if you want to manage them as one, federation is the topic that you should be looking into.
In short, if you're looking for the ring to rule them all,
yeah,
that's the approach.
Exactly.
There.
And so let's get into some more details around what federation is and what it can do.
Okay.
So there's a couple of concepts that we have in federation, pretty simple concepts to be honest. There's basically two roles that a cluster could take within inside the federation. There's going to be one master, or one federation leader as we call it, and there are going to be multiple followers. So you can see in this diagram over here, we have the federation leader circled in that nice yellow boundary, and then we have those three followers that are connected to that leader.
I see. So the guy who owns the infrastructure, the connection between all of them, is going to be the leader.
Yes.
Is there any cross-communication between clusters?
So the individual clusters, the followers do not communicate between them. They work between the federation leader and themselves.
Okay, so it's like a sort of hub and spoke kind of design.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. When we'll go into some more detail about the type of data that is sent between the different clusters, but the good news is we're not shuffling around huge amounts of flow data. Flow data, for example, stays local to the cluster, and it's only configuration data and policy that moves around between those different clusters.
Okay, so you're telling me I don't need that big of a pipe between them?
Yeah, I'm not going to ask for a 40 gig pipe between your different clusters to send all of that flow data. That's one of the reasons that we can hit that very high scaling of federation.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
Because I wouldn't give you a 40 gig pipe between Europe and APJC anyway.
Yeah, no, it's not gonna be cheap, right? So
Exactly.
the federation leader would not have any sensors connect to it. It is still a titration cluster, but it is not going to be receiving any telemetry from sensors. The role of the leader is really about managing the subclusters, the followers that will have sensors connected to them. Now, the federation leader, we have one federation leader. How many followers can we have to that leader?
I don't know. Infinity? No, okay, that would be too good to be true. I heard about a number like 16.
Yeah, so right now we're suggesting around 16 followers would be the maximum that we suggest. Now, 16 followers, if we're talking about the larger titration appliance, they each can do 25,000 workloads themselves. So that means if we do the calculations, we can get to around 400,000 workloads protected underneath one federation.
That's pretty nice.
Yeah.
It doesn't even include the campus users, right? Because they count for a bit less.
Yeah, these are all actual application workloads, whether they are in the cloud or on premises. If you start to factor in users, we could be talking about, I don't know, throw a crazy number out there, like millions of different endpoints tracked, right? So it is really, really high scaling, and it is designed to meet the needs of even the largest organizations where those numbers are actually practical numbers they're dealing with.
So just to make sure I got that right, you're telling me that I could reach, potentially, if I wanted to, up to 400,000 VMs across my environment?
Yes.
That's a lot of VMs.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to see the bill for that many VMs
No,
either.
that seems to be a lot.
So a couple of things about what the federation leader can do. So we know that there are no sensors connected to that federation leader. It is purely dealing with shuffling policy and configuration between the followers. Now, it is the main appliance that you would come to in terms of accessing the user interface.
Okay.
So while the followers still have their own user interface and they can be accessed directly, when you're using a federation on a day-to-day basis, you would go to the master appliance or the leader appliance to actually interact with those subclusters. And we'll look at that in a live demo, actually.
So what you're telling me is that all those guys become sort of, I don't like the term, but sort of read-only for that, and that if you want to make any write changes, it has to go through the leader.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's because all of those changes are synchronized between those different clusters at the same time.
I mean, that makes sense from consistency standpoints.
Yeah. And in terms of talking about consistency, that means things like annotations, scopes, users, and policies are all synchronized in a consistent way between each one of those followers. So if I have a scope on one cluster, I will also know about that scope on a remote cluster at the same time.
Okay, well, that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, we can write policy on the federation leader. These might be global policies that are useful to apply to every single appliance or every single follower. And then on the individual followers, we can execute application dependency mapping on the applications or workloads that are directly connected to that follower. So we can still do the machine learning, we can still do those ADMs to generate policies, even when we're scaling to those such high numbers.
So what we're saying is that if we take our Acme example that we had, if we were Acme across multiple countries across the world, we could actually be setting something like no workloads have direct access to internet across the environment worldwide, but then for every single geography, I could say the local workloads that are located on this site have access to the proxy on this site.
That's it.
Very nice.
Yeah.
CISO must be super happy I've seen that.
Yeah, I mean, it really does give you such a huge amount of control over such a large amount of workloads in one single pane of glass. It's very powerful.
Definitely.
So let's go and look into a little bit more detail around what we do with federation. So when it comes to scope design with federation, there is not a huge difference between traditional scope design on a single cluster setup, but there's a couple of things that you need to know about. So scopes are either global scopes or scopes that are owned by a follower. Typically, the global scopes are those that are higher up in the scope tree. the global policies, the regulatory policies, those that you would want to apply to every single follower. And you can see that here, that the scopes are pushed to all appliances. If I configure it on the master or on the leader, you will see that scope everywhere.
Okay.
That scope can be based on IP policies or custom metadata like annotations.
So in that case, Acme and Inside, if I understand right, are global to everything.
Yeah.
I set a policy there, I set based on tags, I can do whatever I want across the whole fleet.
Correct. And inside in this case could mean everything inside. This could be my workloads, like you mentioned, in Europe. This could be my workloads in the Americas. It really is every single workload, and it's going to select all workloads across every follower.
Okay.
Cool.
That seems easy so far.
Yeah. So those scopes apply everywhere, and the policies applied to those scopes filter on down to every single follower.
I forgot to ask a question, by the way. I mean, can I have a leader with a single cluster?
Can I have a leader with a single follower?
Yeah, a single follower, my bad.
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
Does it make sense?
I'm not sure why you would want to do that, but let's say for a lab and you want to just understand the concepts of the follower and the leader pattern, absolutely, you can test it in a lab.
Okay, awesome.
And we'll go into some more detail around what the requirements are for federation and what you can do in a lab and what we recommend for production as well.
Sounds good.
So when we look at a scope design that is more global, this is where we've introduced two followers. So we have a follower in Europe and we have a follower in the Americas. And the follower in Europe has one scope tree and the follower in America has another scope tree.
Okay.
Those scope trees are shared between those different environments. So the European side also knows about the scope tree on the American side, but this follower will only control policy and enforce policy for workloads within inside its scope.
Does that mean I can define a policy that says, okay, this workload here has access to this scope here?
Correct.
Okay.
When I'm writing policies, or if ADM is running, it will not be limited to the scopes or to the workloads that are locally resident. I would be able to identify a relationship between an application here and an application over there in America.
Okay. But my understanding is, though, as you mentioned ADM, I cannot run ADM, though, across both of them.
No. So when you run ADM, you have to run it locally to the cluster where the flow data is stored.
Okay.
This cluster over here in Europe will not know about all of the flow data in America.
That makes sense. You don't want to put it back to Europe to process, right?
Yeah, you don't want to shuffle that flow data around. That being said, if a workload in the American cluster is speaking to a workload on the European cluster, both sides will know about that conversation. The American cluster will have a record of that flow, and the European cluster will also have a separate record of that flow. So that means that ADM still will be able to resolve that relationship between those different scopes.
I mean, that makes sense. And I remember when we were talking through the scope design options in a separate module, we were talking about those options of locality and potentially having to duplicate ADM workspaces. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that in that event, you would have one workspace for EMER, one workspace, for Americas, but you would still see all the connection between them.
Correct.
Okay.
So we can scale this out as much as we need. You can have one of these scopes per appliance, and you could have up to 16 followers in a federation.
Okay.
Now, in terms of connecting that scope tree as well, it's very simple. You don't have to actually even modify what you might have it on an existing cluster as you join it to a federation.
Okay, so I can just hook up my scope tree or my follower to wherever I want in the scope tree?
Yeah, you can pretty much choose a point in the parent scope tree, in the global scope tree, and attach an existing cluster to that and make it become a follower.
Nice.
You then have the option to potentially move around some of the existing scopes that were on that follower, but if you don't need to do that, you can just literally hook it up and get going.
That's pretty cool. No? So that means I can actually go and take an existing system, so I don't need to buy a leader and a follower to start with. I can actually start with one cluster. When the needs come that I feel I absolutely would need this high-scale platforms or stuff like that, then I can just add a second cluster, add a leader, and start having this view. I don't need to big bang the whole damn thing.
Yeah, it's like Lego. You can just start clicking the pieces together.
Perfect, like that.
Yeah, I know you like that. So, what are some of the common questions? Well, we just covered this one, which is, do I need to restart from scratch.
I'm happy we covered this one because
Yes.
that was one which was very stressful.
Yeah, and in fact, that's a really important thing to point out. You really don't have to think about federation when you're first starting out with titration. You may know that later down the line, federation is something that will be important for you, but don't stress out about it to begin with. Just design your scope tree in the way that you would for one appliance, and when the need comes, you can move your scope tree and plug it into a federation very, very easily. So just keep that in mind.
Very simple.
Now the next one here, this one is an operational question because it's the first thing that comes onto people's mind is, well, if I have a sensor on one cluster, what happens if I want to move that application to another environment? Do I have to uninstall that agent? Do I have to go through all of those fun processes of installing an agent?
I could see that. I was thinking about when you were showing the diagram before, especially if you're in a migration scenario. Migration scenario, you might have one cluster with 25,000, and maybe that spans 10 these data centers today. And now your 10 data centers, actually, 2 of them are becoming really big. So you're going to add appliances for those 2 data centers. But then how do you get sensors off the previous cluster back there? And that's what we call rehoming.
Yeah, and all of that is driven through a user interface workflow so that I can do it very, very easily.
Click, click.
Click, click, all from the leader appliance as well. I don't have to go to the individual followers to do this.
Okay, perfect.
Now finally, the last question. What do I actually need to get started with federation? Well, we spoke about it in the earlier slides about what the federation leader needs to look like. It is a titration cluster. Now what type of titration cluster? Well, that comes down to what you are actually doing with it. So if you are trying to just experiment with federation, something that's in the lab, something that is non-production, and you don't need to actually move that into production, you can go with a virtual instance of titration V in this case. That is permissible as a leader in the lab. It's important that it has to be in the lab there, Remi.
You should have made it bold, I think, but yes, you're right. Lab is absolutely critical there.
Yeah. And the reason being is when you get into production, if we're talking about the potential to scale up to 16 clusters all federated with each other, potentially lots of information moving around, you do want to have that extra horsepower there available that the titration M provides. So it's a requirement of federation if you're going to take it into production to have a titration M as the leader appliance.
Well, that makes sense. So in my lab, I can take one TED-V, a second TED-V, and then put federation if I want to.
Yes.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah. We'll keep it simple for the lab, and then we'll make sure that it's scalable when it gets into production.
Okay.
So, we've talked about it on slides. How about we actually look at a cluster that's in a federation?
Well, I'd like to see it, exactly, because you mentioned a lot about it. I'd like to see what it looks like.
Yeah, it's nice to actually see that things are real. So, what we have over here is a leader. I am on the leader appliance. You can see the fact that I'm on the leader appliance because I'm on the federation screen and it says appliance role leader. And I can also see that there is an extra little segment that's popped up in the top right-hand corner, which is showing that I'm connected to the Shere Khan appliance, which is the leader. There are also a couple of followers, ESX 1002 and ESX 2414, one of which is connected but has some warning notification, and another of which is waiting to connect into this federation.
Okay, I see. Just one thing, wait, Tim, you showed this page, but actually I didn't see it earlier when we had our cluster.
Yes.
Is there any reason for that?
So federation is a beta functionality, and it will be enabled by a license key to enable that federation. So if you don't see federation on your cluster and you want to start experimenting with federation, please do reach out via your account team or partner to make sure that they can get you that license to activate federation.
That makes sense. So out of the box, I take titration. There is no federation.
Yep.
If I have a need for federation, call my usual contacts. They solve it for me. I like that.
So, in this circumstance, we do have federation enabled, and we've already set up this appliance as the leader. Adding an appliance is very simple. I just refer to the name of that titration cluster, and I give it the host name of that system. It's going to walk through a workflow where it's going to generate some certificates so that they can securely communicate with each other and bring up under the hood a Kafka message bus between the two of those clusters.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Yep.
I guess the red button is don't touch.
Well, you know, it's very tempting to touch that. I can mouse over it, but I'm not going to go ahead and disable it. So obviously it's going to also give me a warning saying, are you exactly sure that you would like to disable that federation? And I would say use that very sparingly if you need to.
Yeah, I would agree to that.
I wouldn't click that in production.
I would never do that.
Yeah.
So.
Now, obviously, this page, the particular page that we're looking at here, is protected by role-based access, and only the most ultimate user, the site administrator, can actually get to this page and configure anything to do with federation.
That sounds a pretty good move.
Yeah, it probably does sound like you shouldn't give the average user access to this part.
Yeah, it's a red button. Someone will press on the red button.
Oh yeah, we know that. So we can see that there are appliances inside this federation. So we can see that Shere Khan is the leader, signified by that little tick. And I have these two, one of which is in the ready state, and the other one which is in the pending state. I can see, though, that this one actually stopped checking in, and it's come up with a little flag actually warning me that it hasn't checked in for some while now.
Okay.
I can also see details about the version of software that is running on that follower, and I can get some details about the actual certificates that are there, so that I can take that certificate and join this cluster into the federation.
Okay, that's where I was a bit confused. So it's a two-step process. You go to setup, you type your host name, and you put the friendly name for the UI in there. That generates a certificate for you. You take the certificate, you go on the other side of the federation, and then you upload that cert.
Exactly. So that is exactly what this ESX2414 state is in. It is pending, so we would need to download the certificate, go to that cluster, import the certificate, which would then cause it to relate to this federation. Yes. And it's going to know all of the details about what that federation is by importing that certificate and the associated configuration.
Very nice.
So we have our federation enabled. And what that means is it starts to bring up some changes within inside the user interface. For example, certain different parts of the interface will be marked as globally significant. Other parts will be marked as locally significant.
Okay.
If I come to my scopes here, we're not going to touch on every single part of federation in this particular video, but we can see that one of the main concepts of the federation tree is that I can assign a scope to an appliance. So here I can see that this scope, ESX1002, is assigned to the scope, or the appliance I should say, ESX1002.
Okay.
Signified by the fact that I have chosen the appliance here. So whenever I build a scope, this is going to be visible to me. I can either have it as no selection, which means it's a global scope, or I can choose exactly which appliance I would like to own that particular part of the scope tree.
Okay, well, that's pretty cool.
And like everything with inside scope trees, it is a hierarchical tree, so if I assign the root of a tree to an appliance, it's also going to own all of the child scopes as well.
Okay, just a clarification. I see that hostname contains ESX102. That's just a dummy query you put in, right? There's no requirement for anyone to put that.
Oh, absolutely not. This is just to fill out some data into the scope there. It's the same as all other scope queries.
Okay.
You still select the endpoints that are going to fall into that scope, and it's based on the typical queries that you can execute.
Okay, makes sense.
So we have a scope tree which is flexible. We can assign certain scopes to certain clusters. That's all going to be managed in the backend by Titration. It's also going to be doing things like synchronizing users, synchronizing roles, annotations, and most importantly, policies.
You touched on something, you talked about users. Do I need SSO to be able to use? So do I need single sign-on like SAML or Active Directory for that to work or not?
So we can take a look over here. Remi, do we need to use single sign-on for this?
Seems like we don't.
Yeah, it looks like here we still have local users. Yeah. So if we take a look at some of these users here, we can see, well, there's a lot of different users that we've added to this cluster, and they do have local authentication. So you still have that capability to choose what type of authentication you want to use. It just means that that user will be synchronized across all of those different followers.
I see. Okay.
So we have our users, we have our roles synchronized, we also have our inventory synchronized. So we have the inventory managing the entire scope, not just the individual clusters. And then finally, we have our applications, which you can see here. From one single pane of glass, we're controlling policy for applications that are on different clusters.
That's pretty cool.
So I have my global policy here. You can see that policies that I write here would apply to every single workload, no matter what appliance they are connected to. Whereas the policies here, for example, default ESX2414, would only apply to the workloads that are connected to that cluster.
And when you see like the default ESX with a little name on the top, that's a follower.
Yes, okay. Exactly. And so when I write policies here, whether I want to write those policies by hand or if a policy is based on a scope that is owned by a follower, I can actually run ADM from this centralized point.
Okay.
So to make that clear, the ADM is done through the user interface of the master or the leader.
Okay, so I cannot run ADM cross followers, but to run an ADM on one of the followers, I need to go through the leader. And in the leader, I select start ADM.
Yes.
Okay.
And the leader is going to provide you that one single pane of glass to run ADM on the appropriate scope. Under the hood, what it's going to do is actually send the request to that follower. The follower is going to use its local flow data, its local knowledge of those sensors, which is very rich and doesn't make sense to send everywhere. It will generate the ADM results, create those ADM results, and then send them back up to the master or the leader so that the leader knows about what those policies are.
Okay, so we actually maintain data locality with federation because we don't copy data from one of the followers back to a leader to do some form of analysis.
Yes. But I don't have to be dealing with the fact that I'm jumping from UI to UI to UI to be managing all of those policies. And that does include those policies crossing clusters, knowing about endpoints in different scopes on different clusters. Okay. I just cannot run ADM on two scopes that belong to different clusters.
Okay, well, makes sense.
So it seems simple enough, and it really gives us that powerful capability to keep scaling out horizontally as and when we need to, yet still have that single pane of glass.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That's all?
That's everything we need to know about federation.
I mean, that doesn't seem very hard. So I can start with nothing. I can, so with one cluster. Ideally, you would start, if you look at federation, you'd start with a big one, like a 39RU would probably be where you would start if you're looking at that. And then scale up to whatever number I want.
Yeah.
I believe in tasks, there's no need for federation, right? All that is taken care of for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Even though this was simple, if it sounds a little bit too much work for you, then you can go for the titration as a service option. That's going to allow you to scale dynamically from 100 workloads all the way through to whatever your requirements might be, whether that's tens of thousands or hundred thousands of workloads. So you have those options available in the back pocket to you. Choose the right system or choose the right place to go for, depending on what your requirements are. And if you do need to hit high scale while still having those on-premises appliances, federation is what you're going to be able to use. So with that, thank you for joining us on this session on federation. I hope that was useful. Please go to cisco.com/go/titration.